Do you think you really know why Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed? Most people believe the answer is straightforward, but what if I told you there's more to the story than meets the eye? It's easy to think you've heard it all, that these ancient cities were wiped out solely because of one kind of sin. But the truth is far deeper, and perhaps even more relevant to us today than we realize. You see, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is often oversimplified. Many teachings reduce it to just a single issue, brushing aside the layers of meaning found in the biblical text. But what if that narrow view is leading us to miss crucial lessons about justice, morality, and compassion? What if the real reasons for the city's destruction are hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered? To understand what really happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, we need to step back and explore the historical and biblical context surrounding these cities. These weren't just random places that appeared out of nowhere, they were part of a vibrant region with a distinct culture, geography, and way of life. Sodom and Gomorrah were two of the 5 cities of the plain, a fertile region located near the Dead Sea. The other cities in this group were Admah, Zeboim, and Zor. This area, known for its rich soil and abundant resources, was ideal for agriculture and livestock. In fact, Genesis 13 verse 10 describes the plain as being well-watered, like the garden of the Lord. It was a place of prosperity, luxury, and opportunity. But like many places blessed with abundance, Sodom and Gomorrah were also filled with people who took those blessings for granted. Their wealth and success led to pride, arrogance, and moral decay. They built grand cities, indulged in their comforts, and neglected the basic principles of justice and compassion. This sets the stage for the deeper issues that ultimately led to their downfall. Enter Abraham, a man chosen by God and known for his deep faith. In Genesis 18, we see Abraham receiving 3 visitors, one of whom is the Lord himself. These visitors inform Abraham that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah has become so great that God intends to investigate it and possibly destroy the cities. This declaration deeply troubles Abraham because his nephew, Lot, and Lot's family live in Sodom. In a powerful moment of intercession, Abraham pleads with God to spare the cities if righteous people can be found there. He starts with the number 50, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? God agrees that if 50 righteous individuals are found, he will spare the entire city. Abraham, understanding the gravity of the situation, continues to negotiate, reducing the number to 45, then 40, 30, 20, and finally, 10. And God, in his mercy, promises that even if only 10 righteous people are found, the cities will be spared. This exchange highlights 2 things, God's justice and God's mercy. He is willing to withhold judgment if there is even a small remnant of righteousness. Unfortunately, as we soon discover, such righteousness is scarce in Sodom and Gomorrah. The narrative shifts to Genesis 19, where 2 angels, appearing as travelers, arrive in Sodom. They are greeted by Lot, who offers them hospitality and protection. Lot's gesture is significant because it stands in stark contrast to the rest of the city's behavior. As the evening progresses, the men of Sodom surround Lot's house, demanding to harm the visitors. Their violent intentions reveal a society consumed by corruption, hostility, and a blatant disregard for human dignity. The angels, realizing the extent of the wickedness, urge Lot and his family to flee the city. They warn that destruction is imminent and instruct them not to look back. As Lot, his wife, and daughters escape, the Lord rains down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, completely destroying them. Lot's wife, disobeying the command, looks back and is turned into a pillar of salt, a stark reminder of the consequences of disobedience and attachment to a sinful past. This historical and biblical context gives us a clearer picture of the world these cities inhabited. Sodom and Gomorrah were not destroyed arbitrarily, they were judged after years of unchecked sin, corruption, and injustice. The story shows us that God is patient and merciful, but he is also just. He gave the cities every opportunity to change, even allowing Abraham's heartfelt pleas to delay the judgment. But what exactly were the sins that sealed their fate? Was it just about immorality, or was there something deeper? Common misconceptions about the destruction. For many people, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is remembered as a story about one primary sin, sexual immorality. It's an interpretation that's been repeated so often that it's taken as fact. But is that really the whole story? Could focusing solely on this aspect cause us to miss deeper, more challenging lessons that the Bible wants to teach us? Let's pause for a moment and consider this. What if the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't just about one sin, but about a pattern of deep-seated corruption and moral decay? What if the sins that led to their downfall are more complex, more social, and more reflective of injustices we still see today? One of the most cited passages regarding Sodom's sins comes from Genesis 19, where the men of the city demand to harm Lot's visitors. This incident of intended sexual violence is indeed shocking. But reducing the city's destruction to just this one act is an oversimplification. The Bible itself provides a broader picture, and it's essential we pay attention to the details. Consider the words of the prophet Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 16 verses 49 to 50, God directly addresses the sins of Sodom. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them as you have seen. This passage is clear. The sins of Sodom included pride, greed, a lack of compassion, and social injustice. Their wealth and prosperity made them arrogant. They neglected the vulnerable and failed to show hospitality. Their society was marked by self-indulgence, violence, and an overall culture of corruption. So why do we often miss this broader understanding? One reason is that it's easier to focus on a single, sensationalized sin than to confront a wider pattern of societal failure. Acknowledging these deeper issues forces us to reflect on our own lives and the world we live in today. Are we guilty of the same indifference toward the poor, the same arrogance, or the same failure to extend kindness and hospitality to those in need? Another misconception is that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is only about God's wrath. While judgment is a key part of the narrative, it's equally a story about God's patience and willingness to extend mercy. Remember Abraham's negotiation with God? The cities would have been spared if even 10 righteous people could be found. This highlights God's desire to save, not to destroy. By narrowing the story to just one type of sin, we risk missing out on the full scope of God's message. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah warns against a society that's lost its moral compass, not just in one area, but in many. It's a call to uphold justice, compassion, and humility, values that are timeless and essential for any healthy society. So let me ask you, could we be repeating the same mistakes as Sodom and Gomorrah today? Is it possible that by focusing only on one sin, we're turning a blind eye to the deeper issues of injustice, pride, and indifference? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. The hidden sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. When we think about the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's tempting to reduce them to a single act of immorality. However, the Bible paints a more complex and troubling picture. Their downfall wasn't caused by one sin alone, but by a series of interconnected moral failures that corrupted the entire fabric of their society. These hidden sins, often ignored or misunderstood, provide valuable lessons for us today. Let's explore these sins in depth and see how they contributed to the destruction of these ancient cities. Pride and arrogance. One of the most significant sins of Sodom and Gomorrah was pride. In Ezekiel 16 verse 49, God specifically mentions this: she and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. Their prosperity and abundance led to a sense of self-sufficiency and entitlement. The people of Sodom believed they didn't need anyone, not each other, and certainly not God. This pride manifested in a society that placed personal gain and pleasure above all else. They took credit for their own success and forgot the one who provided their blessings. This arrogance created a culture where humility was seen as weakness, and helping others was considered unnecessary. When pride takes root, it blinds people to their need for change. Instead of recognizing their moral decay, the people of Sodom clung to their false sense of superiority. They dismissed any warnings or calls to repentance, believing they were above judgment. Pride hardened their hearts and led them to disregard the needs of others. In our world today, this kind of pride is all too familiar. How often do we see success leading to arrogance, or wealth leading to a disregard for those less fortunate? The story of Sodom warns us that unchecked pride can lead to ruin, both for individuals and for entire societies. Lack of hospitality. In ancient cultures, hospitality was more than just a courtesy, it was a sacred duty. Travelers relied on the kindness of strangers for safety, shelter, and sustenance. To refuse hospitality was seen as a grave offense. In Sodom, however, this basic principle of kindness was abandoned. In Genesis 19, when the two angels, appearing as travelers, arrive in Sodom, only Lot offers them hospitality. He welcomes them into his home and protects them from the hostile crowd outside. The rest of the city's inhabitants, instead of offering shelter and safety, respond with violence and hostility. This lack of hospitality wasn't just about being rude. It revealed a deeper problem, a society that had lost its sense of human decency. The people of Sodom didn't care about the vulnerable or the outsider. They were concerned only with their own desires and comfort. Jesus himself emphasized the importance of hospitality. In Matthew 25 verse 35, he says, "I was a stranger and you invited me in." Hospitality reflects a heart that cares for others and recognizes the value of every human being. Sodom's failure to show this kindness was a reflection of their deep moral decay. In our modern world, we may not think of hospitality as a life-or-death issue, but the principle remains vital. How do we treat strangers, refugees, or those who are different from us? Are we quick to help, or do we turn a blind eye to their needs? Sodom's downfall reminds us that neglecting hospitality can be a symptom of a much larger problem, a lack of compassion and empathy. Injustice and neglect of the poor. Another critical sin of Sodom was their injustice and disregard for the poor. Again, Ezekiel 16 verse 49 makes this clear, they did not help the poor and needy. Despite their abundance, the people of Sodom chose to hoard their wealth instead of sharing it. They lived in luxury while ignoring the suffering around them. This kind of injustice wasn't just a failure of individual morality, it was a systemic issue. Their society was structured in a way that allowed the rich to thrive while the poor were left to suffer. Instead of using their resources to uplift others, they used them to indulge in their own pleasures. The Bible consistently calls for justice and compassion toward the poor. In Proverbs 14 verse 31, it says, "Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their Maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God." God's heart is with the vulnerable, and he expects his people to care for them. Sodom's failure to do this was a reflection of their spiritual decay. They had resources, but they lacked compassion. They had wealth, but they lacked generosity. Their society became a place where the weak were exploited and the needy were ignored. This sin is painfully relevant today. We live in a world where poverty and inequality are widespread. The story of Sodom challenges us to ask, are we using our blessings to help others, or are we hoarding them for ourselves? Are we advocating for justice, or are we turning a blind eye to oppression, violence and abuse of power? The people of Sodom were also guilty of violence and abuse of power. Their society had become a place where might made right, and those in positions of strength used their power to dominate and harm others. In Genesis 19, the mob that surrounds Lot's house doesn't just want to meet the visitors, they intend to assault them. This display of violence and cruelty reveals a city where lawlessness and oppression were the norm. The strong preyed on the weak, and those who were different were seen as targets. This kind of violence wasn't an isolated incident, it was a reflection of the city's overall culture. When violence becomes acceptable, society begins to unravel. Trust breaks down, fear takes over, and justice becomes impossible. In today's world, abuse of power is still a widespread problem. Whether it's through corruption, exploitation, or physical violence, societies that tolerate such behavior are on a dangerous path. The destruction of Sodom warns us that when violence and oppression become normal, judgment is not far behind. Greed and self-indulgence. Finally, greed and self-indulgence were major contributors to Sodom's downfall. The people of Sodom were described as being overfed and unconcerned, Ezekiel 16 verse 49. Their lives revolved around luxury, comfort, and pleasure. They consumed without restraint, focusing solely on their own desires. Greed leads to a society where people prioritize their own gain over the needs of others. It fosters a culture of selfishness, where generosity and sacrifice are forgotten. In Sodom, this greed went hand in hand with their other sins. Their wealth made them arrogant, their arrogance led to neglect, and their neglect led to corruption. Today, we live in a world that often celebrates excess. The pursuit of wealth and pleasure is glorified, while the virtues of generosity and contentment are overlooked. The story of Sodom challenges us to consider, are we living for ourselves, or are we using our resources to bless others? The sins of Sodom and Gomorrah were far more complex than many people realize. It wasn't just about one act of immorality, it was about a systematic rejection of justice, compassion, and decency. Pride, lack of hospitality, injustice, violence, and greed, these sins created a society so corrupt that judgment became inevitable. As we reflect on these hidden sins, we must ask ourselves, are we guilty of the same failures? Is our society headed down a similar path? These are difficult questions, but they are necessary ones. Relevant lessons for today. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah may seem like a distant historical event, but the lessons we can learn from these ancient cities are incredibly relevant for us today. The sins that led to their destruction, pride, lack of hospitality, injustice, violence, greed, and self-indulgence, are not only things of the past, they are the very issues that our modern world still grapples with. In fact, it's hard to look around today without seeing echoes of Sodom in our own society. Let's take a deeper look at how the hidden sins of Sodom still manifest in our world today and why we should be concerned about the consequences of ignoring these lessons. Pride and arrogance in modern society. The pride of Sodom is still alive and well in our world. In a culture where individualism and self-sufficiency are celebrated, many of us can relate to the mindset of, I don't need anyone, especially God. In a time of prosperity, it's easy to become arrogant and believe that we've achieved everything on our own, without recognizing the hand of God in our success. This attitude often leads to self-centered living, where people focus more on personal gain than on the needs of others. When we are consumed with pride, we often fail to show humility or compassion. We become blinded to the suffering of others, thinking only of our own comfort. Take a moment to reflect, are we seeing this in our own culture? From social media influencers to corporate moguls, the message is clear, success is about me. But the story of Sodom warns us that arrogance and pride are dangerous, not only to our relationships with others but also in our relationship with God. Lack of hospitality and compassion. Hospitality, as mentioned earlier, was a vital part of ancient culture. Today, however, the value of welcoming the stranger seems to be increasingly lost. Whether it's turning a blind eye to refugees or closing our hearts to the poor and needy, we often fail to extend the same kindness and generosity that was so central in ancient times. In our fast-paced world, people are more focused on their own lives, often at the expense of caring for others. We hear of migrant crises, the homeless on our streets, and people suffering all around us, yet we rarely stop to help. We turn away, just like the people of Sodom did, prioritizing our comfort over the needs of others. In Luke 10 verses 30 to 37, the parable of the Good Samaritan challenges us to rethink our attitudes toward the stranger and the vulnerable. The Samaritan, who extended compassion to a stranger in need, was the one who pleased God, not the religious leaders who passed by without a second thought. Today, just as in Sodom, we must ask ourselves, are we practicing true hospitality? Are we caring for those in need, or are we too busy to notice injustice and disregard for the poor? One of the most troubling aspects of Sodom's sin was its neglect of the poor. The rich grew richer, while the poor suffered in silence. Today, inequality is one of the biggest challenges we face globally. According to the World Bank, around 9% of the global population still lives in extreme poverty, despite the world's wealth. This growing divide between the rich and the poor reflects a system of injustice that mirrors Sodom's society. But it's not just about the poor, it's about how we treat those who are marginalized, oppressed, and forgotten. The poor were not only neglected in Sodom, but they were oppressed. The wealth of the city didn't just insulate the rich from the poor, it allowed the rich to exploit and dehumanize the vulnerable. This kind of structural injustice is still seen in today's world. Think about the massive income disparities between the wealthiest nations and the poorest. In many cases, we turn a blind eye to global poverty because it's easy to ignore something that doesn't directly affect us. But Sodom's story challenges us to confront these inequalities. Are we doing enough to help the needy? Are we standing up for those whose voices are drowned out by the wealthy and powerful? Violence and abuse of power. The violence and abuse of power in Sodom are evident not only in the attempted assault on Lot's guests but also in the way that violence was woven into the fabric of daily life. When society becomes accustomed to violence, whether in the form of war, crime, or domestic abuse, it reflects a moral decay that is hard to reverse. In our world today, violence takes many forms, from gun violence in the United States to state-sponsored oppression in other parts of the world. The abuse of power is rampant, whether it's political leaders exploiting their positions or corporations taking advantage of workers. What does it say about us when violence becomes normalized in our media, in our homes, and in our streets? Sodom was a city where power and violence were intertwined. And while we might not be facing the same exact situation, the underlying attitudes of Sodom, an acceptance of violence and abuse of power, still persist today. Greed and self-indulgence in a consumer-driven society. The people of Sodom lived in extreme luxury, consuming without conscience. Their greed and self-indulgence were not only about having more but about living in excess without regard for the consequences. Sound familiar? We live in a society driven by consumerism. Every day, we are bombarded with messages that tell us to buy more, consume more, and want more. This never-ending pursuit of self-gratification has led to a materialistic culture that often prioritizes possessions over people and comfort over community. The people of Sodom were overfed and unconcerned, much like many in today's affluent societies. We are living in a world where personal desire often trumps the needs of others. Social media influencers, for example, promote lifestyles of excess and indulgence, encouraging their followers to spend and live beyond their means. This constant thirst for more is a modern-day version of Sodom's greed. So, when we look at our lives, are we feeding into this culture of excess? Are we prioritizing our own comfort over the needs of others? Sodom's sins remind us that selfishness and greed can lead to the downfall of a society, and it's a lesson we would do well to heed. The sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, pride, greed, violence, and neglect of the poor, were not isolated issues. They were part of a deep, systemic moral decay that led to the city's destruction. And while we may not be facing the same exact problems today, the underlying issues are incredibly relevant. Are we repeating the mistakes of Sodom? Are we letting pride, greed, and violence guide our actions? As we reflect on these lessons, we must ask ourselves, what kind of society are we building? Are we prioritizing justice, compassion, and humility, or are we, like the people of Sodom, focusing on our own comfort at the expense of others? Why a complete understanding matters. Having explored the deep-rooted sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, you might be wondering why it matters to us today. After all, we're not living in those cities, and our world seems so different now. But here's the truth, understanding the full context of the destruction of Sodom is critical for both our spiritual health and our engagement with the world around us. When we only focus on surface-level explanations, we risk missing the deeper lessons that God is trying to teach us. The destruction of Sodom isn't just about a historical event or a warning against a single sin. It's about the way sin works in a society, how it spreads, how it affects people, and how, if left unchecked, it brings destruction not just on individuals, but on an entire culture. Let's dive into why understanding the story in a fuller, more comprehensive way can help us today. Avoiding superficial judgments. A common mistake when we look at the destruction of Sodom is to oversimplify it. We may hear the story and immediately think, Sodom was destroyed because of sexual sin. While that was indeed part of the picture, it wasn't the whole story. When we only focus on a single aspect, we miss the other factors that were equally as significant: pride, greed, and injustice. Having a more complete understanding helps us avoid making superficial judgments about the problems we see in our own culture. If we only point to issues like sexual immorality or a single social issue, we might fail to see the root causes of injustice, inequality, and moral decline in our society today. It's much easier to criticize something we don't fully understand, but when we look deeper, we see how these issues are often connected and part of a larger, more complex moral problem. In understanding the full story of Sodom's fall, we are encouraged to adopt a holistic view of societal decay, where we look at multiple factors, both individual and collective, that contribute to the breakdown of moral and ethical foundations. Understanding the historical and cultural context. One of the most powerful aspects of studying the full context of Sodom and Gomorrah is that it gives us insight into why the people acted the way they did. In ancient times, hospitality was more than just a social norm, it was a sacred duty. To reject or mistreat a guest was seen as a direct offense not only to the person but to the divine law. Today, we may struggle to understand the full depth of this cultural practice. But when we understand the context in which these cities existed, it becomes clear that their failure to show kindness, to care for the poor, and to uphold justice was a direct affront to the ways of God. It wasn't just about one bad habit or choice, it was a complete rejection of God's call to love, serve, and protect others. By recognizing the historical and cultural background of Sodom and Gomorrah, we can draw meaningful lessons for our modern world. It helps us see that what may seem like small sins, like the neglect of the poor or failure to show kindness, are far more serious when viewed through the lens of God's justice and mercy. Strengthening our faith and spiritual practice. A deeper understanding of the Sodom and Gomorrah story strengthens our faith because it reminds us of God's desire for justice and mercy. Understanding why these cities were destroyed makes us more aware of how we can live lives that are aligned with God's values. The truth is that God doesn't just want us to avoid sin, He wants us to live rightly, with compassion, integrity, and a deep sense of responsibility toward the world. By learning from the mistakes of Sodom, we can begin to practice a more profound faith, one that seeks to embody the values of justice, compassion, and hospitality that were lacking in those cities. This understanding calls us to a higher standard in our relationships with others and encourages us to actively engage in making our communities and the world a better place. It's about growing spiritually through understanding the bigger picture, not just avoiding bad actions. Understanding the destruction of Sodom in its full depth helps us draw closer to God, refine our values, and become better versions of ourselves in the process. A lesson of divine justice and mercy. Finally, a complete understanding of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah teaches us something incredibly important about God's character. The story is not just about God's judgment, it's also about His mercy. Abraham pleaded with God on behalf of the cities, asking, "What if there are just 10 righteous people?" Genesis 18 verse 32. God's willingness to spare the cities for the sake of the righteous reveals His desire for mercy even in the face of overwhelming sin. This dual theme of justice and mercy is something we should carry with us. It reminds us that, while sin has consequences, God is always ready to show mercy to those who turn back to Him. His justice doesn't negate His love and grace. If we repent and seek Him, we can find forgiveness and restoration. This is the heart of the Christian faith, the understanding that no matter how far we've gone astray, God's grace is sufficient to cover our sins. The lesson of Sodom reminds us of God's mercy and calls us to turn toward justice and compassion in our own lives. In light of this deep understanding, we can now look at the final piece of the puzzle, how we can apply these lessons to our lives today. In the next section, we'll explore the relevant lessons that we can take from the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and how they can help us live more aligned with God's desires for justice, mercy, and humility. What can we do in our own world to avoid the mistakes that led to their downfall? As we've journeyed through the deep, hidden sins that led to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, we've uncovered lessons that resonate with our lives today. We've learned that the destruction of these cities wasn't just about immorality or sexual sin, it was a culmination of pride, greed, injustice, and a failure to care for the vulnerable. Understanding these deeper, more hidden sins challenges us to examine our own actions in society in a more holistic and thoughtful way. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't just a tale of judgment, it's a call to us to reflect on how we live our lives, both individually and collectively. It's a reminder that our values, compassion, justice, humility, and hospitality, are just as vital today as they were in the days of Abraham. Are we upholding these values? Are we creating a society that cares for the vulnerable and ensures justice for the oppressed? By learning from the sins of these cities, we have the opportunity to change the narrative in our own communities. When we reject pride and embrace humility, when we fight for justice and show compassion, we can begin to make a difference, both in our own lives and in the world around us. These lessons hold timeless significance, urging us to live justly, to be merciful, and to work toward a better future. If this video made you think, leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. What lessons can we apply today? Like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content that connects the past with our present. Don't wait, let's take action together to live more thoughtfully and make the world a better place. See you in the next video. What's one change you can make today to live out these lessons?